So on behalf of NUM Social Innovation Lab and NUM International College, I'm very pleased to welcome Mr. Benjamin Wohlauer to our online guest speaker series this afternoon. Mr. Wohlauer is Deputy Chief of Mission at U.S. Embassy in Cambodia. He arrived in Phnom Penh on July 17, 2020. Before Cambodia, from 2017 to 2020, Mr. Wohlauer was Consul General at the U.S. Consulate General in Florence, Italy. Prior to that, he served in the State Department's Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs and was the Director of the Office of Economic Policy. From 2012 to 2015, he was the Deputy Economic Chief at the U.S. Embassy in Jakarta. Other overseas postings included Milan, St. Petersburg, Rangoon, and Tokyo. Mr. Wohlauer was born in Massachusetts. He earned a bachelor's degree from Grinnell College and a master's degree from George Washington University and the National War College. We're therefore very pleased to have Mr. Wohlauer with us this afternoon to present on the topic of the role of the government in supporting U.S. businesses overseas. So Ben, I will pass everything to you.
Many thanks, and thank you for inviting me, and thanks to everybody for coming out today. You know, these virtual sessions are sadly becoming all too familiar and comfortable, but I really hope that at some point in my three-year assignment here, I'll be able to sit down with you all in person. And we were talking before we started about the Techno Innovation Challenge finals last Sunday, and I know some of the students or some of the folks in the group today participated quite successfully in that competition. So hearty congratulations from my side. Obviously, a priority of the US government globally is promoting STEM education, and particularly among youth and particularly among women. So it was great to see that in action on Sunday, all three categories. So lots of innovative use of technology, a lot of young people, and some of the winning teams had large female components to them. So that was all very gratifying and something I was really glad to be a part of. I have a brief presentation that I'd like to run through. It's something that we put together that gives you kind of the broad idea of what our priorities are, what the U.S. government does to support these priorities, and then what the U.S. Embassy does to support the U.S. government's effort to advance these priorities. But really what I'd like to do during our session is hear your questions and have more of a dialogue. So I'll try to go through the presentation relatively quickly, but please don't hesitate if you want to ask any questions about it, or if there's any terminology that isn't clear, or if my explanation's not clear, please don't be shy. I'm very eager to engage with you. So let me get the presentation up here. All right. All right, are we good? We can see it?
Yes, perfect.
All right. So as mentioned, I'd like to talk a little bit about the role of the US government and of diplomacy, that is what U.S. embassies do to support U.S. economic objectives overseas. We call it economic diplomacy, which is also a terminology that the Cambodian Ministry of Foreign Affairs uses in its strategic documents. I'll go over briefly the role of the embassy and what my personal role is, give you our perspective of the Cambodian market snapshot. It's a very rapidly evolving market. What we do to help U.S. businesses, and then just if you're curious what various career paths there are for those interested in economics and trade abroad in the United States. So what does the embassy do, and what do I do? So the U.S. Embassy is like a corporate headquarters for a subsidiary. So the big headquarters is in Washington, D.C., the Department of State, and in every country in the world with which we have diplomatic relations, which is almost every single one, we have a local headquarters in the capital city. In some countries like Italy, we have a branch office, so to speak, which is called a consulate. but in Cambodia, we just have the big embassy. The embassy is always headed by an ambassador, and the ambassador is the personal representative of the President of the United States. So the President chooses this person to head up the embassy and be his or her representative abroad, delivering messages, advancing US policy goals, explaining US policy positions, and so forth. The Deputy Chief of Mission is sort of the executive officer of this operation. So it's my job to be the key advisor to the ambassador, but more importantly, to really be in charge of the day-to-day management of the post, overseeing the various sections, including the section responsible for economic and commercial engagement, making sure that the environment for them to operate is smooth. And so that's what I do. But I also will get engaged on policy issues, advocacy issues for US businesses, when it's something that the ambassador isn't able to do, but we want to have a senior representative of the US government engaged. So broadly speaking, the embassy is responsible for advancing US foreign policy. And with a new administration that came in January, we have a new interim national security strategy. There'll be a final one later in the year, presumably, but the new administration wanted to get out very early what its key priorities are. And fairly predictable. National interests don't change very much between presidents. Prioritization and approaches do, but the interests stay more or less the same. Protecting the security of the American people, very logical. Defending democratic values, reinvigorating alliances and partnerships, and what's most relevant to our discussion, expanding economic prosperity and opportunity. And this one is a very broad objective. They're all quite broad, but within that, the main priority or the main objective of this priority is supporting jobs in the United States, plain and simple. In part, defending democratic values, exporting US values abroad. In this category, that also is important when we're talking about promoting US investment. US investors bring with them a lot of American values, not just American money. But when we're talking about expanding economic prosperity and opportunity, what we're putting most of our energy in is trying to promote exports, investment, things that will create jobs in the United States. So the Cambodian market. We love this picture, even though it's now 3 years out of date and the skyline's even more full now, but unbelievable growth here. Some of the fastest before COVID, some of the fastest rates of growth in the world. Really, really unbelievable, and I think something that the world has taken notice of. Still a small market, but rapidly growing. Poverty rates have gone down dramatically. Things like penetration of internet, use of cell phones, use of social media, all of these indicators of a growing middle class, consumer class we see and are interesting, let's say, to American companies and therefore to American representatives, embassies abroad. One thing I would point out in particular is that the trade with the United States has grown dramatically, primarily Cambodian exports. They grew about 23% last year in the midst of COVID. So it's really, really unbelievable. The US is by far the largest export market for Cambodia, by far. The largest trading relationship may be with China, but the largest export market is the United States. That's great for Cambodia. It's something, though, that we are trying to explore in terms of getting more American products into Cambodia. So the trade imbalance is growing and is something that we're concerned with. So rapidly growing market, impressive socioeconomic improvements. Also, health indicators are really improving dramatically pre-COVID. Growing middle class, but a lot of challenges remain. and you can see them here, and none of these should surprise anybody, both on the economic side and on the political side of the equation. Keeping in mind, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in detail later, American companies are entirely independent of the US government. So it really doesn't matter to them whether we think they should sell here or invest here. They'll make a decision exclusively on the merits. And this is different from a lot of governments. China is the best example, but even some European governments, are able to either direct some of their state-owned enterprises or have resources available to incentivize their private companies to trade or invest in a certain country. The US does not really have that. We have a few programs to encourage investment in strategic infrastructure sectors, but by and large, the US government does not direct trade, does not direct investment, and we don't. And the US companies wouldn't listen to us even if we tried. So they look at countries exclusively on their merits. What's the economic and political climate like, the investment climate, they call it. So there are problems, but there are a lot of good opportunities here, and you see US companies increasingly showing up in these sectors. As I said, large and growing, well, small but growing consumer middle class. That's interesting, obviously, to American consumer goods companies, to franchises. There's a lot of interest of American companies in taking advantage of Cambodian labor, and that's important. US companies come and they generally offer far better standards work for their laborers, better environmental standards. So American companies get to profit from Cambodian workers, and Cambodian workers profit certainly from American investment. Also looking at things like technology, like power, particularly more sustainable source, things that a growing economy and a growing middle class will have more demand for, medical services, more productive agricultural sector. So these are the things that American companies are looking at, sort of predicting what Cambodia will be like, and seeing if these sectors fit into their international expansion plans. So how do we help? We can't dictate that US companies do something. We don't have a lot of resources to really incentivize companies to do something that they're not otherwise planning to do. So what can we do to help? And I think help is the key word here, because we really respond to demand signals from businesses. We make clear that we're here to help. We have menus of services, particularly the Department of Commerce, which is not present at the embassy here. The Department of State, the Foreign Ministry, covers that role in Cambodia. So a menu of services that we offer to US companies. And that primarily will fall in categories like policy, advocacy, promotion of exports. So we'll do, trade shows. We'll talk to government bureaucrats about regulations that are coming that will be problematic for US companies. We do every year a program called Select USA, which brings together foreign investors, so investors from Cambodia and other countries, with American states. And so that's encouraging foreign investment in the United States, again, with the objective of creating jobs in the United States. We have some regional programming that we do where we try to bring local companies, ASEAN companies, together to network with each other, but also to meet with US government officials to understand what kind of programs we might have that would be of interest to them. And then we do a lot of public diplomacy. Public diplomacy means that we're talking to a local audience, a Cambodian audience, about the United States, and in this case, about United States investors, United States products and services. We do a fair amount here, even though it's a small market and companies, US companies, are still finding their way into it. We do quite a lot, and we've had some good successes. We've helped keep the market open for US auto exporters. You see a lot of Fords here. That required some work on our part to help sort of adjust or explain to the Cambodian government some problems with a regulation that might have made it difficult for these companies to continue to freely export. Likewise, Harley Davidson or motorcycles. And then for General Electric, they had a sale that they wanted to make for medical devices, and we worked with them and the relevant ministry here that was procuring these products to help show that these were, in fact, the best value for the money. And ultimately, General Electric was selected. So these are sort of examples of what success stories we've had over the last year or two. So just to conclude very briefly, and most of these things are relevant primarily for American citizens, but just so you understand the scope. So the Department of State is the foreign ministry. That's my employer, my host. Most of the diplomats abroad work for the Department of State. But we also have the U.S. Agency for International Development, which has a large presence here. They often have a number of programs focused on economic development, improving livelihoods among poor communities around the world. And so they are active here as well. They don't have a large economic development program here, but they do have some things that they're doing in the context of their environmental and health programs. I mentioned the U.S. Commercial Service, which is part of the Department of Commerce. They have a large regional office in Bangkok, but we support them here. And their primary role is to interface with U.S. companies that are looking to create a market for themselves abroad. And then the Foreign Agricultural Service, which is part of our Department of Agriculture. They do the same thing as the U.S. Commercial Service, but primarily, exclusively agricultural products. So they will try to find markets for American wheat, American meat, American wine, things like that, things that are agricultural products in the United States. And so you can see some of the things we did. We mentioned advocacy. We mentioned some of the public diplomacy, where we talk about the benefits of doing business with American companies. But we also advocate on the policy side for things like labor rights. We advocate for things like environmental standards. And then, on a diplomatic, political level, we often will negotiate trade or investment agreements, bilateral trade and investment agreements that make it easier for trade, economic ties to strengthen, and for trade flows and investment flows to increase in both directions. We don't have these agreements with Cambodia, but we do have a framework agreement. So it's not a formal accord, but it's a trade investment framework agreement that establishes a regular series of consultations between Cambodian government officials and American government officials that allow us to lay out on the table concerns we have in each other's markets and find ways to negotiate through them. So it's a great way to identify problems and hopefully nip them in the bud, hopefully stop them from occurring so that we don't have a crisis or a major problem down the road. So that's more or less what I wanted to present to you. I'm certainly happy to answer any questions about the presentation or any other questions that you might have on any of these topics at all, or anything. I'm at your disposal, basically. I will add too, I mean, we don't do a lot of it here, but in some countries, we also do a fair amount of work. And this is not strictly supporting US companies, but we do a fair amount of work promoting, as I mentioned at the top, innovation and entrepreneurship, the development of entrepreneurship and innovation ecosystems in countries, developing countries. We think, again, that's not only good for the economy and potentially for US exporters as you create opportunities for them to sell their goods and services into a more innovative economy. But it's also, we feel, a way to really export US values. We think innovation and the entrepreneurial spirit are two of the most notable aspects of our culture and our tradition that we try to expose the world to. So again, that's why it was so gratifying and interesting for me to be part of the event on Sunday. So let me stop there. Again, happy to answer any questions you might have.
Okay, so thanks, Ben, for that overview. And I should also point out that our master's program in global innovation management here was co-designed with George Washington University through the Fulbright program. So
my alma mater.
That's what I noticed, so I thought I would just mention that. And it's obviously one of the big themes of our university. So let me just invite our first student, Sodani, she had one of the pre-prepared questions that she sent early on. So I think Sodani is on the call right now, yes. Okay, I see her now. So Sodani, maybe ask your question. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, good.
Okay. So good afternoon, sir. It's nice to see you here. I'm Sudani. I'm a senior student of Num International College. I'm also one of the Global UGrad Scholar who will also join the Global UGrad program in fall this year. So my question is, during the global pandemic, so what are the U.S. government initiatives in supporting the U.S. businesses overseas, especially with regard to Cambodia?
Yeah, thanks. And good question, because COVID has obviously impacted a lot of our operations, and particularly things that require face-to-face. We've been able to, I'm glad to say, continue almost all of our advocacy work and support work virtually. There have been a couple of virtual trade missions that the U.S. ASEAN Business Council has led. One of them last fall was quite large and had a chance to meet, again, virtually with the Prime Minister as well as a number of other ministers to talk about specific issues that these companies had in terms of investment climate. So very productive. We've been able to do continue with a number of negotiations here on behalf of US companies, again, sometimes virtually. Sometimes we're able to do it face-to-face with the US company participating virtually. But we've continued to have some good successes directly from the embassy. And also we work a lot with the American Chamber of Commerce here, which is not an official body. It's a private organization, but it often represents interests of US exporters and US investors. And where we have those similar shared objectives, we'll collaborate. And we have a work plan that we've developed that focuses on things like promoting US exports, looking for opportunities and markets for US exporters. One thing that we're really focusing on now is franchises. We're trying to get more American franchises into Cambodia. We've identified that ourselves and also through feedback from the private sector as in a particularly attractive way to enter the market here. Again, growing consumer class, a lot of interest in American products that are sold in these chains, you know, from Starbucks to burgers of various kinds, pizza. So, I mean, these are things that American companies, franchises offer that Cambodian consumers seem to really enjoy. We saw the opening of the Hyatt Hotel recently, which again is something that we're proud of. We think these tourist brands also have a lot of potential here. Obviously, during COVID, it's more difficult, but we're in a position to help them fulfill their objectives here. And I think a lot of them are investing now for a post-COVID future. I think, you know, we continue to do a lot of market research and do a lot of reporting about the evolving regulatory environment here, about the investment climate. Every year we do a report that's made public on the investment climate in every country around the world, including Cambodia. So that's a good snapshot. That's a good way to understand what we're telling US companies about the Cambodian market. And I will note, I mentioned USAID, although, as I said, they don't do a lot of economic and development work here. They have invested a fair amount of money within their COVID response to promote economic recovery. And so that's something that we've invested in. Also, within our environmental programs, we continue to work with communities in and nearby protected areas to encourage their livelihoods so that they don't have to encroach on the forest. We've also worked in the agricultural sector to help farmers harvest and market their produce more efficiently. And these are obviously not creating jobs for the US, but these are supporting development objectives that we have here, as well as I mentioned, exporting US values. And ultimately, we hope creating more wealth here that can be spent on American products. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Great.
Okay, so I have a second question now from Dara Vate. Vate, are you on the line right now?
Yes.
Okay, please go ahead.
Okay, good afternoon, Ben. Thank you for your presentation. I'm a USC student and currently I'm doing global entrepreneurship and innovation. And I actually heard from Steve that you speak several languages, and I'm always amazed when I know this about anyone who can speak a lot of language. So I just want to know how many languages do you speak, and is there any specific language that you would like to encourage the Cambodian student to learn so that they can improve their future career path, be it in the government or the private sector?
Unfortunately, I can't include Khmer in my list of languages, and I regret that very much because I always think that knowing the language of the country where you're living and working is essential to understanding it well and working well in the country. I've been spoiled because the level of English here is so good, particularly among young people, but I apologize for my lack of Khmer. Generally, with the Foreign Ministry, with the Department of State, we're given an opportunity to study languages in between our assignments. So before I went to Italy, I studied Italian. Before I went to Russia, I studied Russian. Before I went to Burma, I studied Burmese. So it's a wonderful advantage that the US government gives to its diplomats. There are some foreign ministries that require you to become a specialist at the beginning. So you become a North America specialist or a China specialist or something like that, in which case you'd study 1 or 2 languages and become absolutely bilingual and fluent. The United States diplomatic service prefers a more generalist approach, where they want to make sure that they have a skilled but flexible body of diplomats that can serve effectively anywhere in the world. So that means they'll teach us many different languages over the course of the career. I'd say in terms of what language you should learn, well, you've already got English, so that's, for better or worse at this moment in world history, English is the primary language of commercial exchange. So I think anybody who thinks about a career in international affairs or in international business really ought to speak good English. There's just the advantages, or let's say the disadvantages of not having good English are really quite high if you want to operate either internationally or with international clients in your own country. So beyond that, though, I would say it just depends what your focus is. Obviously in this part of the world, speaking Chinese would certainly have advantages. If you're operating in Europe, you should probably try to learn 1 or more of the European languages. But I would say English as a foundation, and then learning a third and a fourth language later on as your career aspirations become clearer would be my recommendation.
Thanks for your answer.
Cool. Okay, I'm just looking at the chat right now, and someone is just, they don't give me the question, but they want to give a question. So I will ask Sri Sophia to give her question.
Yes, reflect back to the first question that you answered to us. I just want to know if one day I want to have my own business, or non-student want to have their own business, just want to bring franchise from the US. So what do you think, or would you supporting us?
Yeah. I mean, again, it's something that we think is a wonderful way to expand US business presence abroad. And there are franchise fairs that you can go to that are not run by the US government, but are an opportunity to meet all of the different franchises to decide which one would be the most appropriate for the market here, for your interests. Also, as I mentioned, because American franchises are interested in Cambodia, we're working with the Chamber of Commerce, American Chamber of Commerce, to have some more targeted franchise promotion activities here. We found that in Cambodia, by and large, it's larger corporations, Cambodian corporations, that have kind of a portfolio of franchises that they operate here. But that's not necessarily the only model. There are plenty of stories in the United States and other countries of individuals that have, a pretty good sized franchise empire, own 20 McDonald's or something like that. So, it's certainly, the potential is there for an individual to build a business around owning, as a franchisee, owning one or more franchises. But again, we see it as a great opportunity, as a way to get at this consumer market. Obviously, the next step, or simultaneously, we hope that Cambodian people will import American products that they like. But these are just sort of two methods for Cambodian consumers to get access to really high quality American consumer goods.
And it looks like we have another question from Pise, who wants to ask the question in the chat.
Great.
Hello, thanks. Nice to see you again. I'm Pisai from IBBA program. I would like to ask like two questions to you. Like the first one, like as a university student, like we willing to to learn or to know more about the perspective of person that we look up to. And the question is like, what do you think of the presence of Tesla in Cambodia? Is like we are ready or not and stuff like this. And we are still a developing country. Like for us, from my perspective, I think that we are not ready yet for the station and the road condition and stuff. Like there's also some debate between Thailand and stuff. Like their GDP is higher and the population there's, and that I myself as a Cambodian didn't think that we are ready for Tesla is coming to Cambodia too. And we want to know your perspective about this too. And for my second question, I'm going to ask about one more thing. What do you think that U.S. trade did really affect the relationship? Did really affect because of our relationship between China or any other country which is closer to us than U.S. Thank you.
Good question, and very nice to see you again. So to answer your first question, look, Tesla is an amazing American company. I mean, it's really one of the most remarkable examples of what a driven entrepreneur with a great idea, a huge amount of patience, and tenacity can achieve. The lesson, I think, as I said, I think American entrepreneurs are some of the greatest diplomats because they really can bring this message of perseverance, of ingenuity, creativity to overcome obstacles. And I think it's some Americans at their best in many ways. You know, I'm in favor of all American companies seeking to enter all markets. So I think Tesla trying to enter Cambodia, why not? Why not? I mean, I do agree with you that, you know, any kind of electric vehicle or alternate fuel vehicle, it's not as easy as just importing them on a truck. You need to make sure there's an adequate infrastructure for recharging, that the power grid can absorb the demand. But I think it's important for companies like that to look ahead, to try to think about what countries are likely to be markets in the future, which countries are looking to maybe skip a step and really invest heavily in alternative fuel infrastructure. So, I mean, I think Tesla is doing this around the world and really studying some interesting new markets that may seem illogical at first, but when you're looking down the road as a prospective market 10, 20 years, you know, they want to get in, get the infrastructure built, and have that advantage if Cambodia, from a government perspective, wants to bet on and invest in these type of vehicles. The second question, so I think there's a bit of a misconception about the United States view of China and Cambodia or any other country. And, you know, certainly the United States would never expect or want Cambodia or any other country to choose between the United States and China. I mean, the United States has a very robust economic relationship with China, trade and investment. So that's not the issue. I've heard that repeated many, many times, and I think that's a bit of a misunderstanding. What we are concerned about, there are a few things. One is that if Chinese investment brings with it things like corruption, poor labor standards, poor environmental standards, then we think that's a problem. And I think it would make an economy less attractive to an American investor because it's very, very difficult. As I said, American companies are looking globally and they're looking for countries that have a good investment climate. And if there's corruption, if there's a lack of transparency in tendering processes and contracting, then American companies are probably going to look for somewhere else that's safer to invest. The other thing I'd mention is that, you know, I think, although it's not as much of an issue here as it is in other countries, you know, often Chinese investment comes with loans or other financial assistance that raises the indebtedness level of a country. So whereas the loans create in the short term a new road or a new airport, down the road it can create high levels of debt for the government, which then creates pressures on that government's budget down the road. So we've been outspoken as well on that issue and encouraging governments to look very carefully at deals with Chinese, particularly state-owned enterprises, because often they come with them, they bring with them the risks of indebtedness. But again, I stress, we are certainly not opposed to any kind of free and fair competition, level playing fields where US and Chinese companies compete either for market share or for investment opportunities. I mean, my feeling, and I'm sure my Chinese counterpart would say the same thing, but my feeling is that US companies will win every time because the quality is higher, the values that we bring are better for the average person. And this is, I think, what a consumer would want. And I think this is what a government would want for the long-term development benefits of their country. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Good question. Thanks.
Okay, I'm just.
Can I have another question, please? Yeah, like I wonder, like I've been like looking back and forth about our market, and then I saw that Tesla is coming, but what I wonder is the food chain from like a US company that didn't come to Cambodia, for example. By looking at our GDP, we can afford like Burger King and stuff, but we wonder as a student, like funny question, we wonder why McDonald's didn't come, because in US McDonald's, they are known for the like $4 or $5, $3 or $4, you can fill your stomachs, and they're known for their cheap price. So why didn't they come but Tesla instead?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I mean, this was before my time, so I don't know the story firsthand, to be honest with you. You know, I think it has to do in part, and maybe one of my colleagues who's on knows the story, but my understanding is that part of it had to do with McDonald's franchising model, which is more about owning the real estate, and that maybe there were some obstacles to owning the actual real estate. So a franchisee for McDonald's, you know, McDonald's as a franchise grantor makes more money from owning real estate that they rent out to their franchisees. So, but I don't know the exact answer. But the reality is, I mean, I think you raise a good point, which is, you know, American companies, again, are looking globally. They're not saying, we want to come into Cambodia, let's find a good place to enter Cambodia. They're saying, let's look at around the world and where can we best get value for our shareholders? Where can we make the most profit for what good or service we sell? Some companies are looking more strategically down the road. We want to, like Tesla, we want to invest here now because we think in 10 or 20 years, this is going to be a huge market for electric vehicles. Other companies are looking for a mature market that they can enter and get a piece of. It, you know, just depends on the company and what their business development strategy is. But it is important to remember that for an American, if you want more American investment or American goods and services, there really has to be an effort on the part of the government here and any other country to create a good, healthy investment climate that will be attractive for these companies. And it's not just about foreign governments, right? In the United States, each American state, and there are 50 states, has their own policy where they try to create as friendly a business environment as possible so that a company that's coming to build a factory will do it in California instead of New York. So it's really the responsibility of the governments, whether there's a state or a national government, to compete, to create the environment, to listen to investors and try to adjust their business climate so that it's as attractive as possible to the investors. So that's what we talk to the Cambodian government about regularly. You know, Cambodia still ranks fairly low on the ease of doing business, on the investment climate ratings. So we try to help them with the help of US companies to identify some of the areas that are problematic from an American investor standpoint and offer some ideas or some technical assistance on how to overcome those challenges.
Thank you so much for your answer.
Sure thing.
Dan, I'm mindful of your time. When do you have to leave the session? Just let me know.
Sure, I'm good until 3 o'clock. I'm at your disposal.
Perfect. Okay, so who would like to ask the next question? Okay, Chang-Yi, I see your hand go up there. Chang-Yi, do you want to ask a question?
I think it's Pongsa. He raised his hand up. Thank you.
Oh, okay.
Good afternoon, Mr. Ben. So I'm a junior from the international business program. I just want to know your perspective on the recently news about the regional comprehensive economic partnership of Asian, and particularly with regard to the possible imposition of competition for U.S. exporters to the Asian country.
Yeah, thanks. Good question. So, I think the U.S. government is, we're generally in favor of closer economic integration around the world. We think, I think Cambodia as a market is important, but as a market within ASEAN that, is gradually becoming increasingly integrated economically is more interesting, right? I mean, if you can produce here and export to Thailand without paying any duties, or produce in multiple countries here for export, that is more interesting to an American investor or an American exporter for that matter than if it's just one small country. So RCEP, we don't believe is a particularly high standard agreement. From our perspective, a modern multilateral trade agreement really needs to have strong chapters on environmental protection, on labor standards, on intellectual property rights protection. I mean, these are, in our view, issues that are as important as kind of fundamental tariff reductions or elimination of some non-tariff barriers. So I think that's our view of RCEP. I mean, certainly good to have more integration, but isn't quite up to modern international standards in some crucial areas.
Okay, and I have another pre-question actually on Google before, and I think she's on the line. Miss Yon Lisa was asking a question about, I think, your time in Indonesia, but I'll just see if she would like to ask the question herself. Lisa? I see the name on my screen, but I see that still on mute. Okay, I'm not, so let me just read her question. It was, what was your greatest achievement during your previous position as Deputy Economic Chief at the U.S. Embassy in Jakarta, Indonesia?
Yeah, good question. So fascinating place to work, for sure. Huge market, but some of the similar dynamics, looking at a rapidly growing economy, rapidly growing middle class, consumer class. So a lot of the same U.S. interests here we're looking there. Consumer good exporters, investors looking to take advantage of Indonesia's workforce and position within ASEAN. But one of the more interesting things that I worked on was in the environmental space. We do a lot of work on environment, science, technology, and health cooperation as part of our economic diplomacy. I didn't mention it in much detail in the presentation, but it is a core part of our work. And in Indonesia, those were very, very high priority issues. We're talking now, 6, 7, 8 years ago. So one of the most interesting things I got to do there was broker an agreement between palm oil producers, and they're all competitors, but we sat down with some of the major producers, some Indonesian, most of them were from Malaysia or Singapore, and find ways for them to commit to growing their oil palms and producing their palm oil in a more sustainable fashion. So this is a particular priority because you may know that virgin forests around the world, but particularly in Indonesia, some places in Africa, virgin forest is being destroyed at a very rapid rate for large-scale industrial plantations. It's happening also in Cambodia, by the way, but in Indonesia, it was largely for oil palm production to make palm oil, which is a major demand product, not just for cooking oil, but in all sorts of different products. So we were able to work with them, with some non-governmental organizations, environmental NGOs, with Indonesian government officials, with community groups, to reach an agreement to make their operations more sustainable in return for the ability to sell their product for a premium on the market. So consumers were willing to pay a bit more for these products because they were produced in a certifiably sustainable way. And it was exciting because this was a project that took some time and was actually announced at the COP that year, the Conference of Parties for the UN FCCC. So that was kind of fun, mixing together some diplomacy with some negotiations with businesses and companies, and we were able to put something together that had some sustainable, hopefully, benefits for the environment.
Okay, and I have another question coming through the chat now from Miss Lee Chan Makara. Makara, do you want to say your question?
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you for your time contributing in this session, and for your topic, I make me remind of Mr. Breton Scarney, who has passed away, and very sorry for that. So my question is, what are the challenges that the U.S. corporate faces for doing business in Cambodia? And I really appreciate if you could include regulatory challenge. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Good question. So I mentioned the importance of the investment climate for sure, and the fact that U.S. companies are looking globally for where they want to do business. And they have many different choices, including staying in the United States, which is a giant market. Most American companies do perfectly well without ever, operating overseas. So what are the particular issues that American companies talk to us about in Cambodia? What are the things that we engage the Cambodian government on? Something relevant to you, and I'm happy to see so many smart people getting a good education, because one of the things that we hear a lot about is human resource shortage of skilled labor, shortage of expertise in STEM fields. So I think the more young Cambodians who are able to get advanced education, particularly in STEM fields, the better the investment climate will be, because companies don't want to come in and make a high-tech investment if they can't get enough employees, or if they train their employees and then another company steals them. So that's one. Infrastructure, I think that's normal. Electricity, roads, that's something that's not surprising probably to anybody here, and I know there's a lot of investment going into infrastructure, but that's still an issue. Undoubtedly, the ease of doing business, and I include in that corruption, rule of law, transparency in contracting. These are all things that for an American company are really hard to deal with because they have legal restrictions. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is an American law that imposes very stiff penalties on American companies if they're involved in any kind of corruption abroad. So American companies have to be really careful about getting involved in any deal that's not completely transparent. Regulatory issues, there's no doubt about it. Both the actual regulations, but also the regulatory process. One recent example I'll use is, I think the Cambodian government is aiming to make the country a hub for the digital economy. The Industrial Revolution 4.0 wants to expand digital economy, reduce the digital divide. Outstanding initiative. Obviously, U.S. IT firms are some of the best in the world, and I think very well positioned to help that become a reality. But then we see regulations that have been issued or are being considered, like the National Internet Gateway, like some of the cyber crime rules being considered, that will make it very difficult for US companies to operate, because American companies take very seriously issues like data privacy, privacy of for their clients. And so they're very reluctant to make major investments in places where those type of things are not well protected. What else can I say? Yeah, again, I mean, I think there are some advantages here for sure. Again, consumer class growing, part of ASEAN integration, rapidly growing economy, et cetera, et cetera. But yes, those issues that I mentioned, if there's not progress made on them in a decisive way, I think it will hurt Cambodia's chance to attract at least American investment.
Okay, so we are just about 1 minute away from 3 o'clock. So I'm just wondering if you have any last minute, a bit of advice for the students going forward with their career,
Sure.
what you think they need to do to be successful in terms of skills and so forth.
Well, again, I mean, I think you're by and large off on a very good foot with learning English, getting this advanced management training. You know, I think trying to get involved or continue your interest in innovation and entrepreneurship. You know, these things, in my mind, are going to be the cornerstone of Cambodia's growth in the future. You can't always count on major multinationals investing and getting a nice office job in one of these corporate towers. So, you know, always keeping it in your mind, you know, if you think something should be here, but you don't see it, well, why not try to get that business going yourself? And you'll be a pioneer. It's very early days in that, but, you know, perseverance, think about Elon Musk, right? Perseverance, resilience, ingenuity, really try to learn as much as you can about those particular skills. And part of it is personality, but those particular skills, and think about implementing them when you get out. I mean, in the American culture, you know, trying and failing and learning from that, those are considered very strong points on your resume. So to try out trying out being an entrepreneur, trying out doing something innovative before you maybe go to work for a corporation is one bit of advice. If you're looking to go more in a policy direction, you know, we'd love to see more young Cambodians like you who have a basis in business and economics get involved in the government, get involved in think tanks, get involved in journalism. You know, these are skills that often, including in my own government, are lacking, are de-emphasized. You know, I'll put in a little plug. The U.S. Embassy has an internship program for local students. And so, you know, definitely keep an eye on our website. We have periodic calls for applications. Also, when you graduate, if you're interested in going to work for us or one of the other diplomatic missions here, again, keep an eye on our website. We do have jobs that come up from time to time in U.S. Agency for International Development or the economic section of the embassy. And these are, again, great ways not only to learn about policy, not only to learn about international economic diplomacy, but also to build a contact network across the country. You know, we travel everywhere. We know everybody in government and business. And so working for a diplomatic mission, particularly a large one like the US or France or Australia, really would give you an opportunity early on in your career to learn the policy skills, but also have, you know, really build your network of contacts, and looks great on a resume. So keep an eye open for the internship process at least.
Okay, so thank you very much for spending your time with us this afternoon. And I very much hope that this is the start of more sessions to go in the near future. And this has been great. And our students have definitely benefited from, you know, the information that you provided. And I very much hope that you've also inspired them to think about public service and going to work for government in the future or the diplomatic corps. So again, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to everybody. And I'll say, if any other questions arise, please don't hesitate, pass them through Anand or anyone else. And I'm glad to get back to you.
Mr. Like I would like to say like a short thank you. Like thank you for today, and also we also thank you for any other like U.S. mission to Cambodia, especially the USAID protection on Pralong. We just want to like impress that we are thank you for that. Thank you.
Great. All right. Thanks again, everybody. Nice to see you. Look forward to meeting you in person one day.
Let's hope it will be soon. Thanks a lot, Ben. Take care.
Bye-bye.